Hi everyone, this is Sue McKenna chatting about research ethics, one of the slideshows from phase 3 of the Strengthening Postgraduate Supervision course, which unfortunately we were unable to do in person. So I'm just going to give you a brief voiceover over some of these slides, but feel free to pause and to consider some of the questions I raise as we go along. So, ethics in research can be considered from many different perspectives, especially seen as the specific ethical issues dealt with are very much related to the nature of the knowledge being produced. For example, some disciplines have to worry about dealing with nuclear waste. Some disciplines have to worry about dealing with vulnerable populations. The actual specifics will certainly differ. But most of us use the kind of models of ethics which actually came from the biomedical field. And we talk about these 4 key principles for research which came out of principles for medical research: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So to begin with autonomy, voluntas agrato suprema lex, basically that people have to participate in research freely. And so we need to be very certain that anyone who participates in our research is able to make an informed, uncoerced decision to participate. And informed is crucial there. They need to know exactly what it is that they're agreeing to, how long it will take, what their participation, what form it will take, how their data will be used, and so forth. So a couple of questions you might like to consider. How do your students ensure that they attend to this principle of autonomy? And how do you instill in your students the respect for this particular principle? Can you think of any examples where autonomy is not possible in your discipline? And what do you do then if it's not possible to have complete autonomy? Can you think of any example where autonomy is not a relevant principle for a research study? The next biomedical principle is that of beneficence, salus agrato suprema lex, that the researcher is acting in the best interests of the participant. So how do your students ensure the principle of beneficence is followed in their study? How do they ensure that the way in which their participants are asked to participate in the study is in the interests of those participants? I mean, often we're getting data from participants for our own uses, for the purposes of our research, in order to get publications and qualifications. How will that research benefit that participant? When we make promises about feeding it back into a community, about the research being useful for future generations of students, for example, if our participants are students, how do we ensure that that is in fact the case? Is there ever an example where it's not in the participants' best interests? Can you think of anything like that? And I'm thinking there in particular, for example, in biokinetics, you might ask people to do certain exercises which might cause injury or so forth, and it's not in their interests. Of course, there's 2 related principles. The beneficence, the one I'm talking about now, which is very much about doing things in the best interests of the participant, but there's also non-maleficence, which is making sure that you don't do harm. Are there ever studies where you do one but not the other? And this principle of non-maleficence, primum non nocere, often translated as first do no harm, which those in the medical field will recognize as part of the Hippocratic Oath that those in the medical field have to take, that when you are working with participants, you will not harm them. How do you make sure that your student studies do no harm? And what measures do you take in designing that research and implementing that research to make sure it does no harm? You might like to pause after each of the set of questions to just think about the implications for your own discipline, your own research, and the research of your students. Justice is an additional principle, not in the original 4 biomedical principles, but one that's been added particularly for people working in humanities and social sciences, where you're going to be working on social issues. So the principle of justice really looks at the distribution of resources and access to benefits and asks, is there a fair distribution of risks and benefits? Is research being done fairly, equitably? Is it always being done, for example, in the same small local community who then are asked to participate in hundreds of honours and masters and PhD students' studies without necessarily seeing benefit to them? Are we asking questions about our research, ensuring that there is justice, that things are being distributed properly, that the questions we're asking contribute towards justice? So here you might like to consider who's included and who's excluded in our studies, who is the population and why are they the focus of the study, and how do we select the sample, and is that just? How do you ensure that your students' research is just and that you instill in students the notion of justice as being central to the work we do in academia? Another principle that's been added to the 4 biomedical ones is that of respect. And so respect is a very complicated idea because I think it takes very different forms in different spaces and places. So what does respect entail in the research in your discipline? What form might it take? How is it relevant? And how will you ensure that your students take it very reflectively, very carefully into account, and that they don't just assume that their notion of what constitutes respect is the appropriate notion for the participants that they're working with? How do we foster this idea of respect as a key ethical consideration in the students that we are working with, given that we are preparing them to be future researchers in their own right? Truthfulness and honesty. How do we foster truthfulness and honesty in our researchers that we are nurturing? Are all aspects of the research design always completely truthful? Are there ever occasions where this ethical consideration is set aside? For example, deception. Is there ever a case when you should have participants who aren't fully informed of all the implications or the focus of the study until after they've given the data? And why or when might this be the case? And what problems might arise because of that? A lot of our concern with ethics at the moment comes from a lot of unethical research that has been undertaken. So I'm just going to very quickly go through a few of the sort of very classic cases of unethical research. There are far more subtle cases that I'm sure you can think of that where students may not have thought through all the implications of how they're going to collect data and how they're going to analyze data, and where there are ethical implications. But let's go through just a couple of the worst case scenarios. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment. I've got a YouTube link there, but you can just Google Tuskegee syphilis experiment if you are not familiar with it. But this was a very famous medical research that was conducted from 1932 all the way up until 1972, which was not that long ago. And this was research conducted in the United States through their public health service, in which they were tracing the progression of syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease, and they were looking at the participants were rural African American men, usually very poor, and they were told that they were part of the study in order to get free healthcare for their syphilis. But in fact, although they were being given some kind of placebo and in some cases some kind of minor treatment, by and large the process was really just to track what happens to syphilis if it isn't treated. And you may know that this is an absolutely terrible disease in which people can die very horrific deaths. And even after the Second World War, when it was found out that penicillin can actually cure syphilis, these men were not given penicillin. The studies continued even after a cure was found. Another awful example is numerous examples of research undertaken by the Nazis during the Second World War, in which a number of medical experiments were undertaken on prisoners in Nazi Germany, and they were coerced into participating. They didn't willingly volunteer. They didn't give informed consent. Often the experiments resulted in death and disfiguration and permanent disability. Many of them are considered examples of medical torture. The reality is that the results of that research it has been hugely useful to the medical field. The findings have allowed us to jump forward in much of our understanding about how the human body worked. But the means of getting that information were absolutely horrific. The Milgram experiment, you may be familiar with, a psychological experiment undertaken at Yale University by psychologist Stanley Milgram. And this was looking at the extent to which participants would obey an authority figure. And in this case, the participants were told to give electric shocks to other participants, or people that they thought that they were other participants. They thought that they were randomly put into groups who had to get the electric shocks and a group who had to give the electric shocks. But actually the people getting the electric shocks were not participants, and they weren't actually getting shocks, but they reacted as if they were, and so they would scream and shout and shudder and have fits, while the participants were told to give higher and higher level of electric shock. And the study was to see how far would people go in doing these terrible acts if they were being instructed to do so by someone in a white coat who was screaming at them to do it. Of course, the participants then suffered extremely harmful psychological damage, knowing that they had done these terrible things, even though it wasn't. They were later told that it wasn't actually genuine electric shocks. They had to live with the fact that they would do it in that case. So all of these, again, there's a YouTube video and you can Google any of these, but all of these are examples of the worst case scenario in terms of things that are done in the interests of pushing disciplines further, in the interests of the Knowledge Project, in the interests of research, but certainly not in the interests of humanity and ethical behavior. All of these are research involving human beings, but we've seen examples of research undertaken that does not involve humans or even animals in ways that are equally unethical. So as a result of this, perhaps it's unsurprising that we now have far more rigorous ethical clearance processes. But we also have to bear in mind that, and I spoke about this with you guys the other day, that sometimes in response to this need for careful ethical rigor, what we do is we bring in more and more bureaucracy and paperwork and forms, and it doesn't mean that if we've made our students jump over all the hurdles and jump through all the hoops and filled in all the relevant forms, that they necessarily have been developed as ethical researchers. And I think that we do sometimes need to separate those two things, the procedures from the actual ethical process, and to make sure our job as supervisors is to develop a strong sense of ethical research in our students. And yes, that sometimes entails certain processes and forms and so on, but filling in a form is not enough. We really need to have deep and serious conversations with our students about what constitutes ethical research. In fact, some of the increase in bureaucracy and paperwork, I would argue, comes not so much with a concern for ethics, but sadly with a concern by universities as institutions and others to avoid bad reputations, to avoid the backlash when things go wrong. I think that some of the research does suggest that as our universities become more managerialist, they try and protect themselves from risk by having more and more paperwork and forms to sort of absolve themselves of responsibility. And so they make supervisors and students promise that they've adhered to certain ethical things, so that if things go wrong, they can say, well, you promised, you've signed this form, you said that you would have done things ethically. So I think that we need to balance the need for more ethical processes and keep in mind that that's in order to make research more ethical and not in order to cover our backs. And then a final question there in terms of this notion that the bureaucracy might to some extent arise more from a risk-averse managerialist era than from a deepening concern for ethics, is this question, is there something about living in this era of great technological advances that might bring particular ethical challenges? A few more questions that you might like to consider. There's an ethical clearance process. What is the purpose of that? Who is served by it? What are the strengths and shortcomings of our current ethical clearance processes? And we spoke about this quite a bit when we met, that at Rhodes University there's the central ethics committee, but we also have departmental committees that can consider providing ethical clearance in cases where it's not particularly contentious or dealing with particularly vulnerable groups. To what extent are those committees really tackling with issues of ethics and ensuring ethical rigor, and to what extent are they ensuring compliance with bureaucratic processes? Are we managing to balance this? Does the context of the study and the principles of ethical research into account these processes, or are they fairly generic? Are they allowing for disciplinary norms? And I think that's one of the strengths of having departmental level ethics groups, is there you've got a group of people who should be steeped in an understanding of what ethics, what constitutes ethics within the particular research undertaken within that discipline. One of the clear common aspects of ethical clearance when dealing with humans is that of informed consent and ensuring that participants are fully informed as to what they're participating in. So questions of what is the purpose of informed consent, what process is ideal, what information needs to be included in the informed consent process, when and why is confidentiality important, who can give consent, can children give consent? If you're dealing with children, how do you get consent from the children and from the parents, from the school? Who are the gatekeepers? What might constitute vulnerable populations? So there's a number of issues that one might need to consider, and it's really important to always think about what these ethical issues might mean for your students, your postgraduate students in your discipline. Ethics is relevant for every single discipline, and for anyone to say, well, ethics is not pertinent because of the nature of my discipline, I think that's a mistake. I think it just takes very different forms in different disciplines. Okay, so hopefully that short show has given you a few things to think about, and some of those you might like to reflect on in your assignment.